Chinyanja, Portuguese, and Kiswahili. Are you passionate about radio? And are you looking to work in South Africa? Do you have papers that qualify you to work in South Africa? In that case, we might have an opportunity for you to work for Channel Africa. Send us your CV and demo at newsroom@channelafrica.co.za. Remember, if you don't hear from us within 14 days, it means you have not made it or you have not been selected. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it is 2100 hours on this Friday edition of Africa World Hour here on Channel Africa, the African Perspective. A warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for joining us every other day if you do and when you do, Monday to Friday, as we bring you 60 minutes of the very latest news in and around your world, from the heart of the continent to all corners of the globe. We bring you the voices, the perspectives, and the stories that matter. And of course, we'd like to hear from you, where you're listening from, and what are the conversations that are driving your decisions or are happening now in your community. We'd like to hear from you, your perspectives also on some of the stories that we cover. Plus 2763 406 9126. We've got an interesting show as usual for you this evening. So let's start with your top stories, the headlines.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
And we start with your headlines this hour. We start with this. The Human Rights Measurement Initiative. It's released the 2025 data on Eswatini, painting a very sobering picture of the country's human rights landscape. The organization East and Southern Africa Engagement Lead, Nkosi Sibande, says the report highlights the kingdom's widespread restrictions on freedom, assembly and political participation, and of course deep socio-economic inequalities.
You'll notice that the score on economic and social rights really reflects deep-seated inequalities that exist in Eswatini. The more urgent need is particularly in the right to work and the right to housing. Eswatini is one of the lowest scoring countries again when it comes to the right to work. Actually, all the scores that we track, none of those scores fall under even the fair range of our scores. They all fall between either the bad or the very bad range of our scores.
And activists have accused the Southern African development community leaders of not doing enough to stop the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Congolese writer and democracy activist Kabasu Babu Katulondi says leaders failed to address the matter of last week's 45th Ordinary Summit of SADC heads of state and government held in Antananarivo, Madagascar.
So what we are saying is that they must sit down and because they know, I mean, President Thabo Mbeki was involved in brokering a constructive peace process in the DRC. President Masire was involved. Zimbabwe had been involved in sending troops there in Namibia. So they have not to send troops, but to send wise men who can go and sit down with President Tshisekedi. So he has to take the lead. He's the one who has to promote reconciliation, who has to promote national cohesion, because he cannot lead the country that is fractured, that is fragmented.
And Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu has reiterated his call for Africa to be granted permanent representations to the United Nations Security Council. Political analyst at the University of Dundee in the United Kingdom, Musa Mdunye, says Tinubu's call shines a new spotlight on the continent's powers within the United Nations.
But as 8 years later, and given the size of the African population, given the fact that many of the conflicts the world is dealing with are harbored in the African continent, the call by President Tinubu is a fair one that argues that Africa needs to be given a greater say in the security management of the world. Also, given the fact that many African countries, including Nigeria, contribute quite large numbers in terms of UN's peacekeeping forces. And so it is a justifiable call that Tinubu makes. And it is interesting that it is a call that the great powers themselves have also supported. We know that the United States
and a United Nations probe says more than 500,000 people in Gaza are trapped in famine, marked by starvation, destitution, and preventable deaths. That's the findings of the latest UN-backed Integrated Food Security Phased Classification Analysis. A UN Under-Secretary General of Humanitarian Affairs, Tom Fletcher, says the famine is expected to spread from the North Gaza to regions in the south.
Be in no doubt that this is irrefutable testimony. It is a famine, the Gaza famine. It is a famine that we could have prevented if we had been allowed. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel. It is a famine within a few hundred meters of food in a fertile land. It is a famine that hits the most vulnerable first, each with a name, each with a story, that strips people of dignity before it strips them of life.
And finally, a court in Thailand has cleared the former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra of violating strict laws against insulting the monarchy. The Thaksin has denied infringing Lese Majesté during an interview 10 years ago. The BBC's Jonathan Head has more on that story.
Technically, the Lese Majesty law covers only the 4 top figures in the monarchy. But in practice, it's been interpreted to criminalise any comment or action which might negatively affect the royal institution. This time, the judges interpreted the wording of the law literally and said that as Mr Thaksin had not named names, there was no case to answer. He still faces one more criminal investigation, and his daughter, Paetongtarn, will find out next week whether she will be disqualified as Prime Minister by the Constitutional Court.
Africa World Hour, unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
And that's exactly what we do here on Africa World Hour. Later on, we'll be looking at a discussion that's set to take place this weekend with Oxfam. It'll be led by political economist Dr. Lebohang Pheko. And she asks the question, as they do, what does a caring economy look like? And we'll also tell you in just a moment about the United Nations Children Fund office in Mozambique announcing plans to extend its child grant program to the country's Niassa, Cabo Delgado and Nampula provinces. But just a reminder that you can stream live. We are on the DSTV audio bouquet 802 and we are also on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok and X at Channel Africa 1. Should you want to write into us on Facebook, just do that on simply Channel Africa, and our email is info@Channel Africa, and you can just share with us your thoughts on some of our coverage or what we ought to be paying attention to. All right, so we'll go to that story on Mozambique now. As we mentioned, the United Nations Children's Fund office in Mozambique announcing plans to extend its child grant program to the country's Niassa, Cabo Delgado and Nampula provinces. The fund says the move will see an additional 7,000 families benefit from the critical assistance as the country battles rampant unemployment and instability in some parts. The grant provides unconditional monthly cash transfers to primary caregivers of young children aged 0 to 2 years old. The program also provides supporting caregivers with social assistance, nutrition, and case management to enhance their skills and children's well-being. So I believe we'll be speaking to Beatrice Traga in just a moment. But for now, let's talk about this. South Africa gearing up to host Africa Critical Minerals Summit in Johannesburg next week. General Industry Workers Union of South Africa, GIWUSA, calling for a continent-wide mineral strategy to prevent another, as it calls it, scramble for Africa. The union is also pushing for the formalization of illegal mining, locally known as Zamazamas. Channel Africa's economics reporter Innocent Samusa has more.
A spotlight on South Africa's critical minerals. The country's Minister of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, Mandashe, has emphasized the need for a united approach to critical minerals with the focus on boosting local beneficiation.
We should not be bullied for what we own. We must have a view, and our view must be respected, that we mine these critical minerals. People need them. They must talk to us. We must not give them critical minerals in their own terms, and our views are ignored. Now, I'm talking for the industry now. I'm talking for the industry. You get 30% tariff imposed on you. Please send those critical minerals somewhere else where there are no tariffs, where you get optimal value.
Mametlwe Sebei, president of the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, GIWUSA, has urged African nations to adopt a unified mineral strategy to prevent another scramble for Africa.
The upcoming Africa Critical Minerals Summit, dominated by multinational corporations and parasitic elite behind these corporations, including mine owners, directors, investors, as well as state policymakers and experts, is absolutely illegitimate from our class and political standpoint. These are people who exploit the labor of our members in the mining industry and their lands at their expense and the expense of their families and communities. So they can't speak for us. Proceeding from this composition of the gathering, we can boldly assert that the summit will be nothing more than a sophisticated and a modern rerun of the colonial scramble for Africa. It is neo-colonial summit designed to lock our continent and its people into a role of a mere supplier of raw, unprocessed minerals for the energy transitions and technological ambitions of the advanced capitalists and imperialists.
GIWUSA is calling for the formalization of illegal mining, commonly known as Zamazamas, and has outlined how they believe this can be achieved.
The crisis of illegal mining is a direct creation of the mainstream mining industry's failures. Giant corporations have abandoned mines, retrenched thousands of workers, and left behind vast mineral wealth, creating conditions for disparate people, including many migrant workers from across the region impoverished by capitalism and imperialism and abandoned by the same corporations in these mining-affected areas to risk their lives for a meager living. GIWUSA's call for formalization of artisanal mining is not simple endorsement, but a necessary urgent intervention to save lives, protect communities, and bring this economy under democratic working class control.
For Channel Africa News, I'm Innocent Samusa in Johannesburg.
Right, so let's take you back to that story about UNICEF. It bulking up its plans to help feed families in need of critical assistance, particularly in Mozambique's Niassa, Cabo Delgado and Nampula provinces, which have experienced acute famine, malnutrition, amongst other socio-economic difficulties. We speak now to Beatrice Taga, who is the Chief of Social Protection at UNICEF Mozambique. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for the opportunity, and a very good evening to you.
Let's talk about first the Child Grant Program. How many people was it initially designed to reach since you started providing aid work in the country, and how many are in need of it now?
Yes, very good question. So the program was first piloted in Nampula with a limited number of beneficiaries, and it was piloted as a combination of regular cash transfers to families with children under 2 years old, and as well referral to social services for vulnerable mothers within those households. And the results of the pilot were powerful. Families ate better, children were more likely to be registered at birth, and caregivers reporting feeling more empowered, and violence within the house was reduced. As a result of the positive impact, the government decided to scale up the program with an initial phase of expansion aiming at reaching 175,000 children in Nampula, in the provinces of Nampula, Cabo Delgado, Niassa, Zambezia, and Inhambane. Very recently, we were able to mobilize additional funding that will result in a further expansion to 10,000 beneficiaries, 7,000 of which will be in Nampula and 3,000 of which will be in the province of Niassa.
I want to stay with Nampula and we'll move on to Cabo Delgado. And I'm just wondering because, you know, I've done work, election monitoring work in that region. So that would have meant we would have been part of the census of knowing how large community is and understanding things like how many child-headed households, of which there were many, and the level of nutrition levels were very low. Unemployment was also very high. So just tell me how dire the situation must be now, particularly with the conflict and with the nearby Cabo Delgado region that has also been under siege, because I believe also in Nampula, children would have been kidnapped, etc., etc. So what are the challenges that you've been working with over the past couple of years?
There are several. You're very right. There are serious issues with nutrition. There are problems in accessing a broader range of social services, especially when it comes to Cabo. There are issues with violence and being engaged in conflict-related activities. So vulnerabilities are deep. We recently, as UNICEF, released a report showing the trends in monetary and multidimensional poverty of children, including in Nampula, and they overall show an increase to 70% in child poverty, monetary poverty, as compared to a bit higher than 40% less than 10 years before. So the situation continues to be dire. The needs are immense. Through the child grant, we are able to reach in Nampula currently 37,000 households. With the addition now of 7,000, we'll be able to reach more. But what we are able to support the government with is still limited vis-a-vis the needs that are persisting in the province. So certainly more support is needed, more resources to be able to assist children and ensure that they have a chance in life and they can contribute to the country's growth as human capital, as that the country really needs to be able to advance, besides a human rights perspective, of course. So
and that's a very important
significant
point to raise.
Needs.
The need to empower to a point where, and a lot of these are rural communities which are very far-flung from employment opportunities and have to make means with, if possible, agriculture, where the land obviously is not even arid enough to be able to reach that. But I know they do make do. So I want to get a picture. So when you say you're supporting caregivers, who would those caregivers be? Because again, I point back to the figures that we were dealing with then and saw back then, that a lot of people obviously left these rural areas to go to the urban areas to try and find work, to bring back money, etc., etc. And is the picture the same as in Niassa as well?
Yes, unfortunately is rather similar from the assessment that we have conducted in collaboration with government as a first step in the implementation of the program. And to respond to your question, the caregivers are the mothers, often underage and in need of social service and case management support. They're often victims of violence, or they have different types of vulnerability that requires additional support. Besides the cash. The cash is certainly essential, but to really make a long-lasting and impactful difference in their lives, they need more than that. They need to be referred to services if they need. They need to be able to go back to school if they're underage and still eligible for that. They need to be referred to nutrition services, to health services, and that's why we are working with government to create linkages and a system of referral that can effectively link our beneficiaries to services that are available on the ground. And we are not talking only about social services, but we are also talking about concrete economic empowerment opportunities. So it has to be an integrated, holistic, intersectoral effort to be able to assist beneficiaries in the situation that they're at. And again, it's a small fraction, unfortunately, of what the needs are out there.
So let's zone into that. And I'm going to start at a community level because, as you say, it must be intersectorial. So if you are trying to alleviate the problem of hunger, a school feeding system is something that would also help do that. But I know that the schools also themselves are completely derelict. There are no resources. So how have you been able to help? And also teaching the community to support whatever structures are there to deal with whatever social ills exist.
Indeed, it's a very good question. School feeding, it's certainly something that is of great support within the UN family. That's something that UNICEF and beyond have been supporting. But again, it's one piece to the puzzle. So what the Child Grant also includes, and we are currently expanding that component, it's support the families in improving their nutrition practices. How do you feed your children, promoting breastfeeding, how you diversify your diet. There are many determinants to good nutrition, and they need to be addressed and tackled from multiple perspectives. So definitely the element of changing behaviors and practices is key. School feeding is key. The cash is key, but it's a combination of all of these elements that aims at that will hopefully generate a long-lasting change for vulnerable.
Is really what I was trying to get into. But thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated. Beatrice Targa is Chief of Social Protection at UNICEF Mozambique. That brings the time to 22 minutes past 9.
Africa in Business on Channel Africa.
The United States was very vocal at the beginning of South Africa's G20 presidency, and this is largely due to strained relations with South Africa at the time, that they were not really keen on participating. Where do they stand right now?
The US is planning to take over the presidency of the G20 next year, and our understanding from them is that they intend to continue to do so, and therefore it is quite difficult then to be in a situation where you are not attending deputies' meetings or discussions during our presidency and then to take over the presidency next year. From a finance track perspective, there has been engagement. We've been working on a communique last week and this week here in Zimbabwe. What's important about that is that it's a consensus document. And so all the members in the room have to meet the language that is used there, and our US colleagues have been part of those discussions and negotiations.
Bringing the African markets into your home. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Africa World Hour. Africa World Hour. Unpacking global headlines from an African perspective.
Indeed, at 23 minutes past 9, let's get into the issue of climate change. Rising heat waves, floods and droughts are putting Africa's health systems under growing pressure. In Nairobi, the World Health Organization and the Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund recently hosted a regional workshop to explore new ways to finance climate resilient health systems. Today we speak to Dr. Jeremiah Mushosho, WHO Africa Regional Team Lead for Climate Change, about how the initiative aims to protect vulnerable communities. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Perhaps to just give a bit of context, what are the trends that you are seeing in the region and in these countries that you are working in?
Thank you so much for the opportunity. You might be aware that climate change is one of the single biggest threats to health and well-being of the people in Africa. You may have heard that for the past 2 decades, there were more than 2,200 public health events, and 56% of those events were climate-related. We have seen a surge in climate-related diseases, for example, cholera, malaria, and other diseases which have been worsening, and their breeding periods have been changing due to climate change. And we have seen an increased burden of these diseases. And because these countries are less prepared in terms of their health systems, we have seen that the climate risks are quickly translating into disease burden and death in all these countries which we have selected.
And it's interesting to see that in some countries, unions are pushing for what they call a legal working temperatures. Now, as you say, there's still a lot to learn and glean from in terms of these emerging trends. So in Africa, do we have the luxury of saying that there must be work stoppage under such conditions, or what alternatives are you helping with to ensure the safety of workers in general?
Thank you so much. While the debate is going on, climate change impacts are raging. Africa already has limited health workforce, and the health workforce is being exposed to working conditions which are not healthy for them, and therefore they are not able to render the services to the communities. So we have seen that while these discussions are ongoing, we urgently need to take action to protect the workers who deliver services to the communities. So they are facing quite a range of these problems, and what we have done through one of our frameworks, Building Climate Resilient Health Systems in Africa, we are rallying behind capacity building for the workforce so that they are able to detect, to treat, and to manage climate-related diseases which have been increasing, and we have seen that more and more health systems are breaking down due to these impacts, rendering the health workforce not being able to effectively provide the services which they need to provide.
And a lot of that surely has to do with civic education. So whilst you're protecting health workers on the ground to ensure that you don't overburden the health systems, what tools are they being given to be able to teach communities how to protect themselves, and especially those who are vulnerable?
Information is key indeed, and how we put that information across is also directly linked to how that information is received and used. So we have more than a couple of times discussed with governments to ensure that their training curriculum for the health workforce is aligned to climate resilient health systems, thereby providing them an opportunity to be quite aware of the risks which are there, and also as they interact with the communities, they are able to provide them with the information. What is key right now is to provide practical solutions to the communities. So we are working with the health workforce to be able to give advisories to the communities which will really help them. For example, you have seen that there have been a lot of heat waves. We need to be able to help the communities to adapt. So the health workers are actually equipped to be able to disseminate information which will help the communities to say, how do you adapt to heat? What actions should you take, and what practices, for example, dehydration and many other practices, which would help them in their daily lives. We don't need to tell communities about greenhouse gas emissions. We need to tell them practical solutions. What do they do during the spread of climate-related diseases such as malaria, such as cholera, and during heat waves? What do they do to manage persons who have underlying conditions? How do they treat those situations? So those are some of the practical tools which we have been delivering to the health workers for them to be able to disseminate further to the communities.
The WHO says something in the region of 2.4 billion people worldwide are exposed to extreme heat conditions. And this has, as we mentioned, led to drought and the emergence of diseases such as cholera. But there's also the issue of agricultural labor productivity. People facing starvation and limited resources would still want to go out there and save their crops. So it's more a matter of necessity. What training and education do you give them in this case? Because they're trying to protect livelihoods as well.
You may want to know that the intersection of climate change and health involves quite a lot in terms of the impacts which are being translated into the daily burden of problems within the communities. And food is one such issue which we look at from our nutrition perspective. We understand that agriculture systems need to be climate proofed. So we are working with communities and governments to make sure that we deploy practices such as climate smart agriculture, which would guarantee the communities that they are able to at least produce for their own consumption. Because to adapt to climate change, we need to adopt new practices, especially in the agriculture sector. We have seen quite an increase in the design and implementation of climate resilient irrigation systems. But at the community level, for those small-scale farmers, there's been a move to promote drought-tolerant crops and also to ensure that we prevent post-harvest loss and also to ensure that farmers are able to diversify in terms of their crops so that they continuously get adequate nutrition which they require over and above just food. So these are some of the key messages in some of the line of work where we have been promoting to make sure that communities, small-scale farmers, are able to continue to produce and provide for themselves the nutrition which they so require during this difficult time where climate change is really derailing every single endeavor to achieve sustainable development goals, including food security and nutrition.
All right. And Dr. Moshoeshoe, hopefully next time we'll speak about innovation, technology and employment opportunities while you tackle these challenges. Dr. Jeremiah Moshoeshoe, WHO Africa Regional Team Leader for Climate Change, brings the time to 29 minutes to 10.
Are you fluent in French, Chinyanja, Portuguese, and Kiswahili? Are you passionate about radio? And are you looking to work in South Africa? Do you have papers that qualify you to work in South Africa? In that case, we might have an opportunity for you to work for Channel Africa. Send us your CV and demo at newsroom@channelafrica.co.za. Remember, if you don't hear from us within 14 days, it means you have not made it or you have not been selected. Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Annie Kalonji sur Channel Africa.
Nous allons à présent dérouler notre tapis rouge pour accueillir notre personnalité du jour, l'artiste chanteur Sheky Frey, qui est en ligne de Guinée avec nous.
Je suis un artiste guinéen, un créateur, un styliste et je fais un peu ce qui plaît à mes fans. Voilà, c'est un peu ça. On a beaucoup de genres de trucs à faire, mais bon, pour le moment, on est basé un peu sur le rap.
D'accord. À quelle période de votre vie avez-vous commencé à vous intéresser à la musique, Sheky?
Bon, je crois pas qu'il y ait une période, parce que moi, je suis un mélomane depuis mon petit âge.
Annie Kalonji, tous les dimanches sur Mix Vibration.
1 hour, one continent, one voice. Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla on Channel Africa, the African perspective.
The African Perspective indeed continues here on Africa World Hour, rounding up some of the top stories and, of course, bringing to you stories that not only increase our knowledge, that are of interest, but, of course, where we bring you different perspectives. And this time we look at a bold and very necessary conversation. What if the economy was built to care for us, not control us? This is a question that Oxfam South Africa and their New Economy Hub are asking at their upcoming event, Beyond GDP, measuring what matters in an inclusive economy. And at the center of this conversation is our guest today, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, activist, scholar, and longtime advocate for feminist economics and decolonial development. Dr. Pheko, a very good evening to you. Warm welcome to Africa World Hour.
Thank you so much, Ms. Magwetla.
So let's talk about this conversation. It's framed around radical but very simple question. What if the economy was built to care for us or control us? How do you interpret the challenges in the African context today and what it would eventually look like if we were to achieve that goal?
So I think the one thing is we have inherited or chosen to be beholden to neoliberal economic frameworks, including the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and we've also chosen to then use measures that are not necessarily designed to measure the things that are important to us. So the gross domestic produce is one kind of measure, which normally is really the sum total of a few indicators, but has become this proxy for progress, growth, and development, even though, of course, it was designed to rebuild the European and US economies after the Second World War. And of course, it's now become externalized and internationalized as the thing that everybody pursues. And I think if we were thinking a bit differently around what progress looks like and around what development looks like, we would definitely have very different conversations about what is valuable. So the use of time and the interpretation of time, the definition of work. So including the ways in which we have chosen to interpret productivity in a very narrow way in terms of 9-to-5 jobs. And yet we understand that there are people who work in parallel economies, they work in social reproduction, they do different kinds of care for the community, different kinds of care for the planet, and different kinds of care even for the next generation. Would understand that we cannot only measure growth on the basis of GDP when there's jobless growth at the same time, when there's a growth in unemployment, when there's a growth in poverty, and when there's also an increase in a growth there's a growth in the poverty of social relations. So many different alternative indices use things like voluntary work as a measure of productivity, use things like relationality, our relationality, sense of neighborliness, the ability to feel safe in our own communities, a sense of having love, a sense of having, a faith-based community, different things which possibly wouldn't show up in our conventional measures. But when we think about who we are, especially as African people, they measure up and they're perfectly aligned to who we are.
So you've given us examples of the various indicators that could be used to reflect a caring African society. Are there examples on the continent that have done this exactly? Rwanda's community healthcare workers, I know that's something that of a project that Rwanda is very proud of and invests a lot in. In the South African context, what would it be? Are there other Western countries that we could adopt what would essentially be, in the African context, a well-being economic indicator?
So we already have a few, Ms. Magwetla. We have the Multi-Dimensional Poverty Index, the MPI, which Statistics South Africa has used to great effect. And this measures different things. It measures different kinds of deprivation in the areas of health, education, living standards. And it actually shows at the moment that about 1 billion people globally are living in acute multidimensional poverty. We also have, for example, the Living Poverty Index, which was devised by the Afrobarometer. And this also speaks around a scarcity index, and it tracks day-to-day deprivation. So we know that the $1 a day, or I think it's $2 a day index, has never been adequate because it only measures the things. It measures everything that a person income that they are able to accrue in a day. That includes through begging, that includes through scavenging, that includes through finding the things that they find. And then that is hardly measuring a dignified and decent income at all. So we also have, for example, and South Africa, by the way, has also done pioneering work on well-being economics. I think in 2012, there was an important study that was conducted, which set up aside I think about 12 different indicators, including education and health. Unfortunately, it went nowhere. And then lastly, we can also look at countries like Thailand, which talk about things like the sufficiency economy philosophy, which I really love because it really speaks around developing a national development campus, and it also speaks, in a very deeply ethical way. So they base that in Buddhist principles, but we have a lot of anchoring. We talk about Boto, so forth. And then if you also think around Bolivia, where they talk about buen vivir, meaning a good life, and how rich that could potentially be if we interpret for ourselves what a good life is. Not a good life for a few people who live in mansions, but a good life for the majority of people, for the most dispossessed, and for those who have been the most adrift in the last 30 years.
I think you mentioned the capitalist aspects of the types of economies that we live in, and often the production levels are then measured differently. So if we're talking about young people and the high levels of unemployment that we're seeing not only across the region but in South Africa as well, what would we be reimagining in terms of bringing them in, but also I'm thinking allowing them to infuse their own way of thinking of what they believe a care economy would be and what their contribution could be?
Yeah, that's really exciting. That's actually an exciting question because it's, I think when we think about young people, there's the myth that's been sold to them about the gig economy, about being their own boss, and this Uberization of work, and which we understand now to be incredibly precarious and to be a way that the state has managed to step back and excuse themselves and recuse themselves from actually doing the things that need to be done for workers, including providing pensions, basic protections, basic labor rights, the basics of what it means to be a worker that is nurtured, and instead has built up this myth around precarity, pretending that everybody can be a Bill Gates or a Mark Zuckerberg, which are not really great role models for all kinds of reasons. So I think really what we need to be thinking about are home-based support, agroecology, and building different forms of work so that there is, and different forms of economics which are built around solidarity, that are built around redistribution, and that are also built around transferable skills. That's what's really important. But this also means that we have to have portable benefits for platform workers and for people whose work has been informalized and doesn't really meet the mainstream definitions of what work is in terms of a 9-to-5 kind of gig. And bearing in mind, Ms. Magwetla, that 60 to 80% of people on this continent actually work in what is called, in the parallel economy. Some people will call it the informal economy. I think that's a problematic term, but actually work in the parallel economy. We have to think much more creatively and much more imaginatively about how then to our policy frameworks and our regulatory framework catch up with the realities on the ground.
I was just speaking to somebody from the WHO Afro office who's the climate leader there, and we're speaking about the exceedingly high heat levels that we're seeing. And I was saying to him that some unions are already saying, depending on the country context, that labor laws need to change against workers working in these dangerously high heat conditions. What policy shifts need to be made in order to be in step with the current unknowns of the times that we're facing?
So, I think a few would be to think around what a well-being budget would look like. So we already have gendered responsive budgeting, which unfortunately as South Africa, we haven't been as robust about, even though we are globally the leaders, one of the founding nations in this regard. And that would mean replacing GDP only targets with this multi-dimensional poverty index that I mentioned, adding the Agenda 2063 dashboards into our national and municipal budgeting. That's one very strong possibility. Another would be to rethink the national care accounts and time use surveys. Now, time is a really important part of reimagining and reintegrating our constructs around productivity and our constructs around work. And it also links very closely to our pay conditions and the kind of reforms that need to happen for us to benchmark against ourselves, the best of ourselves, not some abstract world out there. And I think another piece of this, Ms. Magwetla, is to think around social protection floors. We have to rethink the notion of social wages and remove it from the purview of being being seen as some sort of a stigma of people who are either too lazy to work, or who are only in the common franca, they're just having babies so that they can get a grant. I mean, those are just shocking characterizations and really obfuscate very complex intergenerational poverty, the desperation of many communities, and the fact that we have we have issues with child-headed families, with single-headed families, and so forth because of our history. So we really need to rethink ways in which we reignite the social contract, because that's really what a social wage is. It is a social contract to enable everybody in any particular community to live a dignified life while they are trying to transition from one income level or lack of income to the next. The money that enables folks to get to interviews, get their taxi fares to get to where they need to, buy a tie, print the CV, and all of this. But basically, all of these things are also to do with how we then rethink the notion of how we are in community with each other.
And I'd imagine the role of society would be to choose government who would be able to build a capable state for that, or at least hold accountable the leaders that are in place to do that. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, speaking to us about their conversation that is happening this Sunday, so don't miss it. It's on the 24th of August at Breeze Block in Johannesburg. Oxfam South Africa and the New Economy Hub will host that discussion led by Dr. Lebohang Pheko. And you heard the question that is being asked, what does a caring economy look like, and what if we had an economy that was built to care for us and not to control us? That brings us to 14 minutes to 10.
Annie Kalonji sur Channel Africa.
Nous allons à présent dérouler notre tapis rouge pour accueillir notre personnalité du jour, l'artiste chanteur Sheky Frey, qui est en ligne de Guinée avec nous.
Je suis un artiste guinéen, un créateur, un styliste, et je fais un peu ce qui plaît à mes fans. Voilà, c'est un peu ça. On a beaucoup de genres de trucs à faire, mais bon, pour le moment, on est basé un peu sur le rap.
D'accord. À quelle période de votre vie avez-vous commencé à vous intéresser à la musique, Sheky?
Bon, je crois pas qu'il y ait une période, parce que moi, je suis un mélomane depuis mon petit âge.
Annie Kalonji, tous les dimanches sur Mix Vibration.
At the forefront, the most pressing issues on Africa World Hour with Sipiso Makwetla.
Channel Africa. And we continue with Africa World Hour. It's a Friday, and normally we try and ease off a little into something that could help you plan your weekend further. You heard if you wanted to engage in an enlightening discussion on the economy and society. That's happening on Sunday, but let's look forward to what's going to happen at the end of next month so that you can prepare for it. If you haven't bought your tickets yet, people have been speaking about it. We're talking about the Nairock Sculpture Park. It becomes the stage for the BMW Art Generation Volume 3, a festival of imagination, legacy and cultural dialogue. Presented by FNB Art Joburg and BMW South Africa. This edition is themed Tropology Between Image and Imagination. It's about reclaiming histories, interrogating identity, and using art as a methodology for shaping futures. With legendary names like Sipho Hotstix Mabuse and Zanele Mholi, alongside genre-defying voices like Msaki, this promises to be more than just a gathering. It's a call to reimagine African art and what it means today. We're joined now by the curator of this year's program, Kim Candon. Kim, a very good evening to you. Just reading that introduction, obviously borrowed from what you've shared with us and what I'm imagining, how it all comes together. It sounds so exciting.
So thank you so much for having me on. You've really condensed it and put it put it forward very well. And as you said, it's our third iteration, and we're very excited to present this third iteration and put forward the best of really what Africa has to offer, and bring together art, culture, and thoughtful, generative conversations.
So when we're talking about building a tradition, rather than staging a once-off event, I mean, it's sometimes a struggle, isn't it? Cultural landscapes, because they evolve and they struggle with continuity in terms of the concept, some of the exhibitors or curators. So tell us what your thinking has been behind this, and what are you looking forward to giving us while still continuing with that thread, but that is fresh and relevant?
Sure, and that's such a good point. We've been very, we've benefited a lot from our partnerships. For instance, this is the BMW Art Generation, as we call it, and it is made possible because of really good support from a cultural brand that is BMW. But it allows us to create and build on ideas and put forward things that can be long lasting. So from inception, this program was about how we look at ourselves as Africans. The question that is posed, one from an outer lens of people looking at us as Africans, but then also from how we can as Africans reclaim our stories and retell them and put forward something that we're happy with. And so from the outset, that is the curatorial kind of direction that I've taken with the platform, and coming together and kind of culminating this year into a topology between image and imagination, and bringing out the idea of how we can kind of see ourselves and imagine ourselves, and bring into the fold those ideas that are often so left behind, the cosmologies and the mythologies that influence a lot of our cultures, bring that to the fore and allow for that to allow us to imagine what we are for ourselves.
So imagination juxtaposed or as methodology, how does that translate, particularly for the artists? I mentioned quite a number of names who themselves are, a huge part of South Africa's cultural landscape. Hotstix Mabuse is very much in the archives of some of the greatest artists on the South African music scene. Msaki, that I've mentioned, these are of different generations, and of course, Sanele Mholo herself has done such provocative work on such important conversations. So give me a sense of how they're going to struggle with this.
Hopefully not struggle at all.
Not struggle as in, but the struggle in the good way of the struggle. Yes. So I mean, you've made a very good point, and it's a very central part of the BMW Art Generation, and that's why we've titled it that. It's because we want to bring together two generations of artists, curators, performers, academics. Bring them together, have performances, have celebrations, have discussions, have a transformation and exchange of information between these two generations of practitioners. And so that is really a through line in the BMW Art Generation, which started at the first iteration. But as exactly as you say, having these iconic performers and artists brought together this year. Hotstix, for instance, he's really from the formed a crux of the music industry, jazz industry, all those years ago. Living in from Soweto, a space where there's been 2 Nobel Prize winners. It's all this super content rich, heavy
history that we are bringing out, that we are celebrating, brought together with, Zanele Moholy is a legendary photographer, probably one of Africa's most well-known photographers, but still, in terms of age, I think Moholy just turned 50. So, she's very, very young in terms of what she's done, but reached such heights across the world. So we are now being able to put these practitioners together on African soil, have these conversations on African soil, have these celebrations.
That the festival itself runs the risk of being elitist, where it's supposed to be a space of real and widespread engagement. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. So, Moholy is, as you say, an activist addressing issues of, quite marginalized communities and realities. At the same time, you've got to look at this as an investment, actually, on the part of BMW. There's not a lot of corporates that have an entire office within their brand dedicated to culture. For instance, the BMW Art Generation has a head of group culture who really drives the investment in culture. So if you look at the support that they give, having on board artists like Moholy, Bernie Searle, Kemangwa Luhe, Kenneth Montague, who's actually coming down from Canada, a collector whose collection has traveled through museums throughout the world, super, super high profile, together with Sipho Hastings Mabuse, Monet, Msaki, all for a ticket price of 500 Rand. You've really got to think that it's the reason that this price can be put forward is because of the support that BMW has given for it. So it's if you look at it from a purely kind of monetary lens, it's actually a very, very subsidized program. At the same time, there are outreaches within the program that are happening. BMW supports as well the Zeitz-Moka, Africa's biggest museum. They've sponsored actually the educational program, and it's called the BMW Center for Art Education within Zeitz-Moka, and they will actually be hosting a workshop for the local Komdrai community during the program. So there are avenues that are allowing for broader access, but there's also the fact that a large investment has been put into making these performers accessible as much as possible.
Kim, just a quick and final one. Where can tickets be found? Are there still any? A latecomer like myself who's now thinking, do you know what? I think I might just attend.
Lovely. Yes. So tickets are available on our website, artjoburg.com, as well as through Tixa. As we said, it's 500 Rand a ticket. We also have a bundle deal with FNB Art Joburg the following weekend, Africa's premier contemporary African art fair, for 640 Rand, I think. So you can attend both, very well priced, and you really get a bang for your buck, I think.
All right, Kim, thank you very much. All the best to you. Kim Candon is the curator of this Narox Festival. So tickets at tickets.tixsa, that's Tixa, that's how you spell Tixa.co.za. That's how you can get your tickets for that event on the 30th and 31st of August. And that's how we come to the end of Africa World Hour this Friday. I hope you have a brilliant weekend ahead and you enjoy the rest of you listening here on Channel Africa. Shayla Ndukumana is up next with African Diaries.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to